Hello, good morning, everybody. My name is Deval, and thank you for joining our workshop today regarding understanding and configure your QuTS Hero NAS for optimal performance. And I'm joined with today with me is Daniel, and And today we're gonna go through. Let me share my screen first. A few minutes.
So we'll be hopefully helping you understand QuTS Hero better, the ZFS file system better, and how to optimize, for performance and safety and optimize for your use case.
Yes. So let me share my screen quickly, and we can get that started. Now, if you guys have any questions during the workshop, you can always unmute yourself or put up your question in the chat, and hopefully we can we'll be able to answer that for you. But we'll have a dedicated Q&A session for you, so we can always go through that as well. All right. So today's agenda again. We're going to introduce the QuTS Hero 5.0, and we're going to talk about how the ZFS helps the data protection, performance advantages, and with larger pool, right? The QuTS Hero can support up to 1.25 petabytes of a single storage pool. So that's a large storage pool. We're going to explain how you can achieve that, best practices as well. Part 2, we're going to learn how to optimize your the QuTS Hero for best performance, and understanding your rate expansion options. Then we'll stop for Q&A session. And then after that, we're going to start with understanding ZFS caching, and also best practices on creating an iSCSI LAN or shared folder within the QuTS Hero. And then again, and we'll end this with another Q&A session. Okay, so let's get started. So before we get through the slides, I want to just go through some landing pages. So we just released our new operating system, new version of QuTS Hero, which is QuTS Hero 5.0, and it does. There are some benefits with the QuTS 5.0, majorly with our. If you have an SSD NAS, that's a great performance benefit. We're going to talk about that further. But some upgrades to this is a dedicated ZIL or slog with QuTS 5.0. So no longer you need to share that with L2R. You can actually dedicate a ZIL SSD caching as well. Okay, you want to talk about that?
Yeah. So ZIL can accelerate your writes when you have to do synchronous I/O.
Yep, and some other upgrades are improved security. So we now support TLS 1.3 for improved security as well as performance over when you're accessing a web browser or the internet. We now have public SSH key, so you can now create your own public SSH key to access or have more secure SSH access as well. And then we also now allow you to create your own admin account. So no longer need to use the default admin account. You have to create your own admin account when you initialize your NAS. This prevents, this improves the security as you no longer. So when somebody's trying to guess your account, your username, so your username and password before QNAP, everybody knew what QNAP's default login is, right? Admin and whatever the password. So they only have to guess the password. With the new update, because you're going to create your own admin account, they also have to guess the username and also have to guess the password. Another advantage is because this is based off Linux, admin account is actually the root root account information for your Linux system. So in case of somebody tries to hack in, they can get access. If they get access to your admin account, they can have actually the whole access to your whole unit using SSH as well. So that also prevents that as well. Another improvement that we have is WireGuard VPN. We now support WireGuard VPN server as well as client with the QVPN 3.0. So once you upgrade your QuTS Hero to 5.0, you can upgrade your QVPN or add QVPN services, and you can now access WireGuard, which is a lightweight and most secure way to access or create your VPN tunnel as well. And we also now support Edge TPU for if you use the NAS for QUMAGI for object recognition, face recognition, and all those other features that QUMAGI provides. We now support M.2, so you can now purchase Coral M.2 accelerator or your USB accelerator. So you can now purchase USB accelerator or Coral M.2 accelerator that is only dedicated to do real-time video analytics for object recognition, face recognition. So it will be much more faster, and your CPU usage will drop because there's a dedicated TPU that's doing that particular process. And now we also added drive analyzer as well, so which is DA drive analyzer that you can purchase a license from, which with QNAP and U-Link technology, QNAP can now predict a drive is about to fail even before Smart can throw that error out to you, so you can do a preventive care by replacing the drive as well. And more importantly, you now have free exFAT support. If you have an external hard drive with exFAT format, you can just connect that to your NAS and no longer need to purchase a license for that. And also instant clone as well. So QNAP already had option to do SnapSync, which basically clones your primary NAS as storage, shared folder iSCSI into a secondary NAS. And then in case of the primary NAS goes down, secondary NAS can take over. But with now instant clone, you can actually clone that snapshot that you've taken or SnapSync snapshot that you've taken into another clone. So your original snapshot is intact and you can work on the clone. This is great for, as I mentioned, DevOps, that for app developers or database testers or analyzers. So because now you can actually clone your original snapshot into another snapshot, and then you can work on that cloned version. So you can test your applications, you can do other testing as well. You can do app development for that as well. Yeah, I'm gonna allow them as well. And then lastly, we now have QoS. So with QU-WAN SD-WAN works with QU-WAN SD-WAN solution. You can now have QoS. Basically, if you have a NAS with multiple network cards, and you can now actually use QoS to actually assign a network card to do high priority stuff. For example, if you do your NAS for SnapSync, you can actually have 25 GB card that does SnapSync, so have high performance because that's high priority, right? And then for other applications like lower priority application like file server, you can actually assign another 10 GB maybe card for that. And then for lowest priority, like just backing up here to cloud. 1 second. All right, so yeah.
Hello, everyone. I'm Daniel, and I like to recommend builds and configurations for use cases. And I'm really excited to talk about QuTS Hero, our ZFS-based operating system. If I were to describe what QuTS Hero is something designed to look and feel as much like QTS as possible, but we use the ZFS file system. And ZFS is a file system really built around safety first, very safety-oriented. And there's also some performance advantages as well. And some of them are actually quite significant, which we'll get into. But really, ZFS is safety first, and then there's performance benefits as well. So ZFS offers data self-healing to heal data corruption if it should occur. Copy on write is to prevent data corruption. Most of our Hero models support ECC RAM to prevent corruption, and our Hero now support more than 65,000 snapshots to protect from file deletions or unwanted changes. And then with our Hero NAS, we have some excellent high-speed storage options. I could have also mentioned bigger storage pools, so great for people who need like a petabyte of storage.
Yes. Now, the QTS, you had limitation of the maximum storage pool was 208 terabyte, and maximum volume was 250 terabyte, right? With QTS Hero, the storage pool can go up to 1.25 petabytes, so a very large storage pool, and then you can actually create a similarly large shared folder that expands your whole storage pool, or an iSCSI volume or iSCSI LUN that spans your whole storage pool. So you're no longer limited to 250 terabytes. You can actually go up to more than a petabyte of storage for your shared folder and for your LUN as well.
So you might ask, well, why do I want all these features to protect from data corruption? And data corruption, that's not like it happens all the time or anything, but there are ways it could happen. So if there's first of all, there's a picture of a picture that's been corrupted. Like you can tell that picture used to look like something else. And corruption can mess up not just photos, but it can mess up applications. It can mess up all kinds of things if it should happen. Some of the things that could potentially cause corruption are a power outage during a write. Now, our copy and write feature can really help protect from this, but that's one of the things that can cause corruption is a power outage during a write. A power surge, like if lightning strikes your building or right next to your building. You damage your drives in some way. A power supply failure during a write. Bad RAM, especially if it's not ECC RAM. Or sometimes if a drive is about to fail, it can throw some errors and cause some corruption.
Yep. Again, so it's just that this happens in the background. You may not even notice it with QTS here. Again, basically main causes, again, power outage is the main cause of this issue. So in case if you're writing some data and suddenly you lose power and you don't have a UPS battery backup, your QTS or ZFS can help prevent that as well.
So one of the protections from this corruption is data self-healing to heal corruption if it should occur. The way this works is every block of data has a checksum. So if the block gets corrupted and you read it, the checksum you read does not match the checksum recorded, and right away it should know it's corrupted. And then it just can use your RAID redundancy to get the correct block. And it actually overwrites the bad block with the good block. So this is a picture of RAID 1, just because it's easy to explain. There's another drive with another copy with another duplicate block that's good, a good block. It actually reads the good block, overwrites the bad block. You got two good blocks again. It's easy to show in RAID 1, but this works in RAID 5, 6, whatever. As long as you have RAID redundancy, this works.
And this happens automatically, so you don't need to do any kind of file system check that you used to do in QTS. This happens in the background. It already happens. So there's certain scenarios that would trigger it, such as reading the data or performing RAID scrubbing. So we always recommend your RAID scrubbing, that you need to perform that once every month. So that usually happens during the first of the month, and you can schedule that as well. So that will help with self-healing as well.
So self-healing was to heal corruption if it happens. Copy and write is to prevent corruption from happening in the first place. And specifically, it's there to prevent the kind of corruption that can happen when a write is interrupted halfway through overwriting a block of data. If you think about a halfway overwritten block, if it's halfway overwritten, you don't have the original state of the block. You don't have the final state of the block. A halfway overwritten block is garbage. It's not good for anything. And in some cases, it can cause minor things. In some cases, it could mess up the whole file. So what copy and write does is it prevents that kind of corruption from happening by causing you not to directly overwrite blocks of data. So in these pictures here, you can imagine those bottom 4 blocks are like a Word document. And let's say you're modifying a paragraph. So you're modifying 2 of those bottom 4 blocks. So with copy and write, instead of overwriting those 2 blocks, you write 2 brand new blocks. And the advantage of this is if your write gets interrupted, you might stop yourself from writing the 2 new blocks, but you're not going to corrupt the original block. So the way this works, you write 2 new blocks, and you just move the metadata over to point at the new blocks. So have that mouse just a little bit on the slide. So for example, if at first, you see, here it goes. If at first you read the file from these 4 blocks, now you point the metadata to read the file from these 4 blocks.
Which is the green. So the green is the new block that you've written.
Yeah, and so first advantage is if you interrupt the write of these new blocks, these blocks are intact. So interrupting the write might stop you from saving your most recent update, but it should not corrupt the whole file. The other advantage is since you're not overwriting these blocks, they actually stay in place. So you can always point the metadata back. So if you point the metadata back to the original 4 blocks, you read the file in the previous state. You point the metadata to the new blocks, you read the file in its current state. So this is actually how our snapshot feature works. We're using the copy and write feature for a snapshot. Leave the original blocks where they are, just point the metadata back. Because we're using a file system feature for our snapshot, it's more efficient, and that's one of the reasons why we could have 65,000 snapshots. That's a lot more than what you could have in normal QTS.
Exactly, and this will help you, so in case when you're writing data, and in case if there's a power failure, and you were in the middle of editing a document, this prevents that to happen, right? Because it already, the original file is always intact. So just the QNAP just has to refer back to the original blocks, and your data is back the way it was. The only thing you may lose is please mute yourself. So. Perfect. So so again, so when there's a new block written, if it's successfully written, the QNAP just points it at the new block and your file is new. But with snapshot, you can always go back to the other version if you needed to. So in case if you want to go back to your previous version, and if you do have snapshot enabled, QNAP can just point to the original box, and you can get the original box back. So don't. So what I was saying is, in case of the power failure and you were in the middle of writing the new block, the only thing you may lose is what you are trying to write, right? So whatever you're trying to write, is that the only point? That's the only data loss that may happen. But the original data that will remain intact within the QNAP.
So I do want us to talk. We want to talk about performance, because this is a workshop on how to optimize for performance. And so even though ZFS is #1 at safety first, there's some great performance advantages. And the first thing I want to mention is that with QuTS Hero 5.0, we've significantly increased the SSD performance. So if you look at like our TSH2490FU, we increased the read IOPS by about 300%. And that same hardware, just like a firmware update, increased read IOPS by about 300%. That's amazing. And then we increased the sequential throughput by about 50%. And now if you look at these numbers for the sequential, I think it's even more impressive than 50%, because the read from drive speed. So this here is the read from drive speed, because ZFS has RAM cache. There's the read from cache speed and the read from actual drive speed. The read from drive speed, now 7,492 megabytes a second. Now before, it was 3,489 megabytes a second. So we actually more than doubled the read from drive speed. But I think the reason why we're just saying 50% gains is that we were not able to double the read from RAM cache speed. We did increase it, but we weren't able to double it. And so the RAM cache speed matters, but in a lot of cases, the read from drive speed matters even more. So we more than doubled that. That's very significant performance gains for QuTS 5. Now, I do want to mention, though, that these extreme gains, the most extreme gains are when the SSDs are really fast. You know, this is the screaming fast all NVMe. I mean, if you have 24 NVMe drives and they're all like 2,000 megabytes a second, I mean, think about like 2,000 times 24 is like a theoretical performance of all those SSDs. So I mean, these are screaming fast SSDs. When the SSDs are so much faster than you know, other bottlenecks in the NAS, you can access that data in a more efficient way with your CPU. There could be some great performance gains. If you have some HDD storage, there should be some gains, but they won't be this pronounced. Basically, the faster the drives, the bigger the gains when we make it more efficient in how we access the data. The slower the drives, the smaller the gains. So for HDD storage pool, there's gains, but it won't be that extreme.
And this is why we have our test unit for this presentation was the TSH2490FU, which is a 24-bay U.2 NVMe drive, so the fastest drive available. So you get the maximum benefit out of that NAS. And then for getting this performance benefits, all you have to do is upgrading your firmware from your current 4.5.4 to 5.0.0. Nothing else needed. You don't need to reinitialize your whole NAS to get the performance benefits. Just keep using the way it is. Just upgrade your firmware, reboot your NAS, and everything should be up and running as well. And the next part is learn how to optimize, the storage pool and understand RAID expansion options.
So as we talk about performance, I want to focus a bit more on HDD performance for a bit, because right now I think most of our customers still primarily use HDDs for their storage. And ZFS has a lot of features that can really help HDD storage pools perform better. And I want to start off with two basic principles. First of all, HDDs perform better for sequential access than random access. I mean a lot better, like orders of magnitude better for sequential access than random access. So a file system that will make the reads and writes as sequential as possible is going to maximize the performance of HDD pools. And Hero has some features to make the reads and writes more sequential. The other thing to consider is you likely have multiple HDDs, like you might even have a lot of HDDs. So even if each individual HDD is not that fast, if the file system can scale performance well with number of HDDs, you can get a lot of performance when you have a lot of HDDs. So a file system that scales performance well with number of drives will perform well if you have a lot of HDDs. Remember, we could have more than a petabyte storage pool with a lot of HDDs, and QuTS Hero can really shine there. So some performance enhancing features in QuTS Hero. There is inline compression. So basically you take data into the NAS's RAM and you compress it while it's in the RAM, and then you write it to the drives in a compressed form. And what that means is throughput into the NAS is greater than throughput onto the drives because you're writing compressed data to the drives.
So basically more data that's coming into the NAS, but less is written onto the drive eventually because everything is done within the RAM before it actually touches your hard drive.
Yeah, and so what's really cool about this, let's say you just had like 4 hard drives, RAID 5. The max throughput of that pool might only be like 600 or 700 megabytes a second. But if you're writing compressed data, you might be writing like 900, 1,000 megabytes per second into the NAS before you hit the max 600 or 700 megabyte per second your drive storage pool could have. So inline compression can actually improve performance. It's not just for more storage. Obviously, it's going to give you more storage, but it can also improve performance. Now, these next 3 features, right, coalescing, prefetch, ability to set block size, these are all related to this first principle. A file system that reads and writes as sequentially as possible can maximize performance of HDD pools. All these 3 are about keeping the reads or writes as sequential as possible. So write coalescing, you take all the teeny small writes, hold them in the RAM for a little bit, and take the small stuff and group it together into larger chunks. And then you write these larger chunks more sequentially onto the drives, which can greatly increase your write performance by making it more sequential, because HDD drives perform a lot better sequentially than for random.
Again, if applications suggest database, right? So database has a lot of smaller writes. So QNAP can help group them together when it's written onto the NAS, and then you can sequentially write that into the hard drive. So again, those get maximum benefits. Other applications also do get benefit as well.
Yeah, exactly. The more random the writes are, the more write coalescing helps, as it makes it more sequential. And database tends to be very randomly written usually, so write coalescing can be great for making those writes faster. So prefetch is about helping to keep the read sequential. And prefetch is a little more complicated to understand, but basically it helps keep the read sequential when you have multiple users reading from the NAS at the same time. So let me try to illustrate the problem that prefetch is here to solve. First of all, if you just had one user reading one large file, it's going to be mostly sequential. They'll just read this block, that block, that block, that block, that block in sequential order, no problem. But what if you have 4 users, each reading a different file? User 1 reading this file, user 2 that file, 3 that file. Well, the blocks of data can be demanded from the NAS like this if they all read at the same time. User 1 demands the first block of this file. User 2 demands the first block of this file. Remember, this file is in a different spot in the drives. User 3 demands the first block of that file. User 4, first block of that file. User 1, second block of this file. Every block that's demanded is demanded from a different file and a different spot of the drives. So now you have blocks of data being demanded from the NAS in a non-sequential order. What prefetch does, it allows you to read asynchronously. What that means is you can read blocks of data in the order that is sequential instead of reading blocks of data in the order that they are demanded. So prefetch is there to recognize a pattern of sequential access. So it might recognize, oh, for this stream, this person's reading in this direction, this person reading in this direction, reading in this direction. So then instead of reading this block, then read that block, read that block, read that block, it can maybe read, let's say on average prefetch 6 blocks. Let's say on average read 6 blocks sequentially, then jump here and then read 6 blocks sequentially on average, then jump here, read 6 blocks sequentially on average. I mean, sometimes you'll prefetch maybe more blocks, sometimes less blocks, but let's just imagine an average you prefetch 6 blocks. So now instead of jumping to a new place every block, maybe on average you can read 6 blocks at a time, much more sequential. So prefetch helps make the reads stay more sequential when you have multiple users reading at the same time. Now the other thing to help keep it more sequential is the ability to set block size. And if we go back to our prefetch example, imagine on average we're prefetching 6 blocks. Well, how sequential that is might really depend on your block size. Like if you have a 4K block size, and you're on average prefetching 6 of them at once, then 4K times 6 is 24K. So let's say you're reading 24K sequentially before you jump to a different spot in the drives. 24K is not that much. It's really not that sequential. But if you choose 128K blocks and you're able to prefetch 6 of them on average, now you're reading 768K sequentially before you jump to a different spot in the drives. That's a lot more sequential. So prefetch and ability to set block size can help keep the reads more sequential when you have many users reading medium to large files at the same time.
Exactly. So applications such as media streaming, file server, or video editing, those are great examples where you would get the maximum benefit for using block size and the prefetch method. Is because those first of all, you have multiple users accessing different data, right? So prefetch can help understand which blocks needed to be prefetched, and also they do read, and there are large chunks of data. So there's always it's always large block size that QNAP has to fetch for that user. So again, file servers, video editors, or maybe media streaming are the users who will get the maximum benefit out of this feature. Right?
Yeah, exactly. Like if you're just reading random stuff, a bunch of tiny files, and it's just random by nature, prefetch is probably not going to help. But when you're reading medium to large files, it's great for video editing. Now, I want to just take a moment to be fair to other file systems and say a lot of other file systems do have a prefetch feature, but ZFS prefetch is especially advanced. Like one of the things it's good at doing is recognizing a sequential access when it's sequential on a stride. And here's what I mean by this. What if 4 people wrote a file at the same time, 4 different files at the same time? Well, if all 4 write at the same time, what could happen is this file is on every 4th block. This file is on every 4th block. So ZFS prefetch can actually recognize when you're accessing on a stride. So if it sees, oh, you're reading every 4th block, that's a pattern of sequential access. Let me prefetch every 4th block. And so that's the scenario where ZFS can really shine, is a more advanced prefetch that can work in scenarios where a lot of other prefetches just fail.
Yeah, other prefetches may only just open up or prefetch the next block. But ZFS understands your pattern of reading that data, and it will prefetch whatever it thinks that you may need next, and which is usually correct, because ZFS understands that you're reading the 4th or 5th block, or every 4th or 5th block, and it will read that rather than just getting the next block, which may just you may just not need that at that point.
So something else that's great about ZFS is it natively writes to all the RAID groups in the pool at the same time. Meaning with more RAID groups, you get more performance. Like if you imagine this like a 24-bay NAS with 3 RAID 6 groups, you write a file, it actually writes to all 3 groups at the same time for faster write speed. When you read that file, it reads from all 3 RAID 6 groups at the same time for better read speed. And this is even true if you add an expansion unit. So let's say you have a 24-bay and an expansion unit with maybe 2 more RAID groups. Now you got 5 RAID groups to write to all 5 at once, read from all 5 at once. So you actually, with ZFS, with QuTS Hero, you add an expansion unit and you actually get more performance. So these ZFS units can really shine. Like you have to do like a petabyte of storage and just add an expansion. I mean, these can really shine on the large performance, but so a lot of the other features I mentioned will also really shine. Even with like 8 or 12 bays, they shine. But if you need really high capacity storage, they shine even more.
Exactly. So we have our NASs now support up to 16 expansion bays, right? So for those units, you will get the maximum benefit out of the new feature sets, and then that's why you have 1.825 petabytes. And you still can you're still not getting just a lot larger storage pool, but you're also getting the benefits of having to write or read from multiple RAID groups at the same time with CFS's technology, rather than other file system may write one RAID group, and after that it will expand to the other RAID group and then the other RAID group. Right.
Yeah. Now, something else I want to mention is that with QuTS Hero, it tends to, in most cases, perform a little bit better if you choose smaller RAID groups. So instead of just a few really large RAID groups, maybe more smaller ones in most scenarios work a little better. And in order to explain this, I want to go back to the scenario where we imagine we were prefetching 6 blocks. So let's say we're reading a 768K of data before we jump to a different spot in the drives. But each block is actually striped among all the drives on the RAID group. So if you have 12 drives RAID 6, you have 2 drives for parity, 10 drives for data. So the 768K is split amongst 10 drives, which means that 768K of data you read before jumping to a different place, but you're reading 76.8K from each drive before you jump to a different place, because all that data is split amongst 10 drives.
Exactly. And if let's say, for example, each drive is running at 158 or 200 megabytes per second, with let's say 10 drives working together in tandem, instead of reading for that one single drive, the whole data set, a whole block set, you're just getting 150 megabytes or 200 megabytes per second. But when you're reading it from multiple drives, all the drives, all that 150 megabytes all work together in tandem, giving you the aggregated speeds of whatever of that number of drives, 150 into 10. So that's how your speeds are aggregated when you're in a RAID group.
Yeah, RAID groups do help you get better speeds. But in this case about sequential, it's just good to notice that, like, if you have a larger RAID group, in this case 12 drives RAID 6, in that previous scenario, you're only going to read 76.8K of data before jumping to a different spot on the drives. But if you choose a smaller RAID group, like with RAID 10, each RAID group is only 2 drives, because a bunch of 2 drive pairs is RAID 10. So now you take your 768K of data and just split it between 2 drives. And now from each drive, you're reading 384K of data before you jump to a different spot in the drives. So RAID 10 is significantly better at keeping the reads more sequential when you have a whole bunch of users reading from the NAS at the same time. And just in general, the smaller the RAID groups, the better it can keep the access more sequential as you have more users reading from it at the same time. And so that's one of the reasons why we don't now allow larger than 16 drives in a RAID group. So like if you have like 24 drives, you can make a RAID 60, because that's like, 2 RAID 6s or 3 RAID 6s, but you can't just make a 24 drive RAID 6 anymore. We decided not to allow that, one, for performance, because with smaller RAID groups, like you see, reading 384K from each drive before jumping to a different spot is a lot more sequential than reading 768K before jumping to a different spot. Now imagine if it was 24 drives RAID 6, you'd even cut this number in half. So one reason is for performance. We don't want a RAID group too big. Another reason is RAID rebuild speeds. You rebuild faster with smaller RAID groups. So also for safety, we have limited the size of a RAID group to 16 drives. And so it's not, so you can just make this decision, like if you have a 24 bay, do you want to do RAID 60 with 2 RAID 6 pairs, 3 RAID 6 pairs, RAID 10, but just in general, smaller RAID groups can maintain throughput better when you have many users at once. But just to step back for a bit, I do want to say, for most users, RAID 6 on like a 12 bay or 8 bay is usually more than enough performance. And so I'm not saying everyone should just use RAID 10, because it does cost half your storage. In most cases, RAID 6 is great. But if it's a scenario where there's just a lot of people accessing at the same time, like I came across a scenario recently where someone wanted like 30 video editors. I think they were editing like 1080p or something. So that's like the bandwidth seemed possible for like the throughput, but with that many people at once, I was wondering, well, will this stay sequential? And so when you just have a lot of people accessing the NAS at the same time, RAID 10 could be an option to consider. And
also when with QuTS Hero, it doesn't allow you to add a single drive, so it's very important that you plan your upgrade or expansion strategy well before you build your system. So I think that's the tips for expansion, right?
Yeah. So yeah, with QuTS Hero, you could expand a storage pool, but you can't expand a RAID group. So what that means, if you have, let's say you have an 8-bay NAS, and you think, I'll just buy 4 drives, make 4 drives like RAID 5. Then later you buy 4 more drives and think, okay, now I just want to change it to like 8 drives RAID 6. You can't do it. You have to take those 4 drives and make another RAID group. And you can add it to your storage pool. You can make your storage pool bigger, but you can't expand your RAID. So one of the things you really don't want to do is, like, you have an 8-bay, and maybe you make like 6 drives RAID 5 or 6 drives RAID 6, and then later you buy 2 more drives. What are you going to do with those 2 more drives? I guess you'll make a RAID 1. It's not a great situation to be in. So with QuTS Hero, if you can afford it, it's often best just fill all the drive bays with drives. But if it's a larger unit, let's say a 16 bay, 24 bay, another option to consider is you could fill half the bays. Like a 24 bay NAS, put just 12 drives now. That means you have a 12 drive RAID group, and then later you could add another 12 drive RAID group. And then when both RAID groups are equal size, that's still pretty good for performance.
Exactly. And most scenarios, you probably won't need that space when you initialize your NAS, right? When you initialize your NAS, it's a brand new unit, you're going to start filling up the data, right? So you can plan your upgrade strategy at that point, right? Let's say it's a 24 bay. Now we also have a 30 bay unit, right? So for 24 or 30 bay units, or even 16 bay units, let's say you can just start with half of the drives at this point, and then you can start using a NAS, right? There's no when you fill up your NAS with half drives, you can still use a NAS with the same capacity. Sorry, so with the same. So you can still use a NAS with all the feature sets, right? And then when the time comes, you can keep adding the drives. And then once you reach your maximum capacity, then you can, let's say you filled up the next 12 drives, the next 16 drives, the next 15 drives, you can then upgrade your RAID group to add that drives. And one thing to note is it's highly not recommended to have one RAID group RAID 5, the other RAID group RAID 6, or the one RAID group RAID 6 and another one RAID 5, or don't mix the RAID groups in a single storage pool.
Yeah, this is important to know that in a storage pool, if you lose one RAID group, you lose the whole pool. So if you have a bunch of like RAID 6 for more safety, and then you just add one RAID 5, well, if you lose the RAID 5, you lose everything. So you're only as safe as your weakest link in your pool. So that's important to consider.
Okay, that's it, right, for this.
Also, I should mention one more thing, actually. ZFS does natively write to all the RAID groups at once, but it writes to, how often it writes to them depends on the space. So for example, if you had a 24 bay, put 12 drives in, fill it halfway up, and then add another 12 drives. Now your second RAID group is empty, right? So it now has twice as much space as your first RAID group that is half full. What that means is it writes to the new RAID group twice as often as the first RAID group. And what that means now, if you have two RAID groups, the pool theoretically has twice the performance. But if one RAID group is half full and one is empty, it writes to this one twice as much as that one. Now, theoretically, your pool is only 1.5 times faster. Now to get to practical for a little bit, I mean, if you have 10 gig, even a 12 drives is already probably as much as you're limited by your 10 gig. So I don't think you notice the difference really. But if you say put a 25 gig card in there,
or even 40 gig or 100 gig, because now we do have those options, right? So for those units.
Yeah, so there are some scenarios where you might actually notice the difference and see better performance if you just put all your RAID groups there at the same time.
Okay, before we get to the live demo, there are a few questions that we have. So first is, good morning, new owner of TS453A using QuTS Hero. Oh, Gary, that's great. Yeah, the 453A does support the new operating system, so you can upgrade that to QuTS 5.0. Another question is, I think it's referring to the RAID 10. I think that's what it is, because it's saying that it's great for performance, but has a big impact on available space. Having 3 RAID 6s instead of 1 RAID 6 is actually get better performance, right? So it's correct. Right? So having multiple RAID 6 groups and then one single storage pool is better for performance. Right.
Yeah, as long as you have enough drives. If you have like a 24 bay, yeah, like 3 RAID 6s should perform better, but give you a little bit less storage. But if you just had like, if you had just like an 8 bay, I probably wouldn't make 2 RAID 6s. But when you have enough bays, then yeah, you typically get better performance if you have more RAID groups, but you get a little bit less storage.
Sebastian has a question. Why did you change the option? Because it was possible previously. I think it's referring to the RAID limitations.
Yeah. Like before, we would let you make like a 24 drive RAID 6, and it's a balance, right, between letting you do whatever you want, even if we don't recommend it, versus preventing you from doing something that we think would be a really bad idea. And there's a balance there, because not every QNAP user is that technical, and just some people don't know that like 24 drives RAID 6 is really bad for performance. They may not know that RAID rebuild times are really long, and that can make it less safe. And so there is an aspect of wanting to protect some of our customers who maybe don't know these things, and so we don't let people do certain things that we think are a particularly bad idea. But the other balance is, what if there's a rare use case where this actually makes sense? And don't you want to just make that choice for yourself? And it's a balance for us, because there are some customers who just don't know how dangerous that is or how bad it is for performance. And we don't want them to have a bad experience with our NAS.
Yeah, so I think that is it for questions for now. Guys, again, if you have any questions, you can always unmute yourself and keep asking questions away. That helps us as well, because if you have, we can always go back and forth and then and elaborate more on the questions as well. But if you do not have a mic, you can always, as everyone is doing right now, you can always put your questions in chat, and we can always answer that as well. We'll just take a few minutes, and then we can start answering the questions. Now, that's so for the live demo. Today's live demo, we're going to be covering how to first create storage pools, shared folders, ISCSI, and then we're going to go through caching options as well. So first of all, as I mentioned first, on the QuTS Hero 5.0, the first thing I want to show you is disable the admin. As I mentioned before, admin account is disabled by default. So when you initialize a NAS, now the QNAP will give you the option to create a new user account. For example, for here I created my with my name Deval. So I've created a user account which is Deval, and the admin account will be disabled by default. Now, if you do want to enable this, you can always come here and enable this by just clicking uncheck the box. But we highly do not recommend doing that. Now, we just had a question from Gary, is that how to set up a new admin account. To create a new admin account is very simple. Just go control panel and users and click on create user. Just put in a user. Let's say Daniel, enter the password. And then once you enter the password, under the user group, make sure you check administrator. And then under administrator and then shared folder permissions, you can give permissions to all the folders that you have. And once you have done that, you can also, by default, if you select admin, you should have access to everything. But the only difference is under shared folder permissions. If you have a lot of shared folder permissions, you won't see. By default, it won't be allowed. It will be denied access on certain accounts. You can just enable. You can just provide them read and write access. And once you have done that, the application privileges, you should have access to all the privileges. So once you've done that, hit create, and that will create a new admin account, and you can log out from the current account and then log in with the new account, and that is how you just create a new admin account. Now, for users who are coming from 4.5.0, you probably are using admin account, so just come here, create a new account. As I mentioned, just create a new admin account, and then just change yourself to administrator, and then log out from the admin account, log in with the new account. Just come here under same page, use control panel, privilege, and users, and then just click on this edit button and disable this. So now the default account is now disabled, so no people won't be able to allow or won't be allowed access to admin account. So hackers who are trying to get into your NAS, who's trying to guess your password, won't be allowed to access that. So that's one way to create a new admin account. So that's one feature that we introduced with QuTS 5.0. Now continuing on further with the demo today, so we're gonna first now create a storage pool. So creating a storage pool, I'll show you how to create a storage pool. To create a storage pool, you go to storage and snapshot and storage/snapshot, and then we already have a storage pool created. Now, I think we want to talk about some tips and tricks here. So if you have for QZFS NAS, we always recommend to have SSD storage pool, at least the first one, your system pool, because the first storage pool you create will be your system pool. So we always recommend to have SSD as a system storage pool. Is that correct?
Yeah. Particularly with QuTS Hero, it just runs better if the operating systems and the applications are on SSD storage.
Now, for NASs, like I have a 973X, I have dedicated 4 SSD bays. But if you don't have NASs with dedicated SSD bays, you can always sacrifice a couple of bays. You don't require that much. Minimum is, I think, what, 240 gigs? Yeah, 240 gigs is your minimum required storage pool size. So anything above that, so even a couple of drives with RAID 1, couple of SSDs with RAID 1 should and you can create a storage pool out of that. For NASs that have NVMe drives, that's perfect. You can always create an NVMe SSD. You can just plug in your NVMe drives, create a storage pool on that, and then you can use the rest of the hard drives as your hard drive storage pool. Now, I already have a couple of storage pools. One is my system storage pool, which is based off the 2 SSD drive that I have on my NAS. And then I have a storage pool, which is the regular storage pool, which is based off the regular hard drive, which is my data storage pool as well, where most of my data will go. I would create a storage pool. You go to create and click on new storage pool, and then just follow the instructions. Basically, you select your hard drives that you want. You can select which RAID group do you want to, or what RAID type you want to have, RAID 5, RAID 6, RAID 60, RAID 50, RAID 10. Select that here. Now, for example, if you're expanding, let's say if you want to expand, I'm just going to go through that as well. Expanding a storage pool is also simple. On your existing storage pool, hit manage and click on expand storage pool. And then for QuTS here, you're going to be forced to create a new RAID group. That's how it is. Select the new storage, the new sets of hard drive. Make sure you select the same RAID type that you have with the original storage pool, and then hit next. It will start expanding the storage pool. Now, going back to creating a new storage pool, just create new storage pool. Select the hard drives. Now, if you have expansion base, it will be listed right here. So this is the enclosure unit, which is the main unit on your NAS. And if you have multiple enclosures, like you have enclosure, as mentioned, you can now have up to 16 enclosures on most of our NASs. So if you have spare hard drives on different enclosures, make sure you select that correct enclosure, and then you can select your hard drives. Hit next right here, and then you can optimize pool, which requires at least 100 gigabytes. But it will, when you create a storage pool, it actually optimizes the storage pool. And during optimization, you won't be able to access the storage pool, but it optimizes for performance. So I do highly recommend doing that. It's just depending upon the hard drive size and SSD drives, it may take a while to optimize it. Once it's done optimizing, you can then start using a NAS. You can also do pool over provisioning, which allows you to, again, pool over provisioning allows you to, with ZFS, again, it collects a lot of garbage, like copy and write and all those features. There's a lot of garbage collection that happens within ZFS. With pool over provisioning, it actually keeps 10% of your pool to store all that garbage collection, so you maintain a stable performance even when you start filling up your hard drives or your storage pool. Now this comes in handy when you fill up your storage pool to over 80% or 90% capacity, right? So once you start filling up your storage pool, your 10% can help you maintain a stable performance, and also increase the SSD lifespan, because it can always use that 10% to store that garbage collection. Is that correct?
Yeah, and then also we even recommend that like at least 10% over provisioning for HDD storage as well. And remember what I said about copy on write? It'll often leave those old blocks of data in place, so you can put the metadata back. I mean, because it's leaving old blocks of data in place and writing new blocks in slightly different locations, if there's just a little bit of free space, it can write things in a much more sequential way. But if the NAS gets like 99% full, it can get really fragmented. So you pretty much don't want a QuTS Hero NAS to ever get more than 90% full. And I think that's why by default we make over provisioning 10% even for HDD storage.
Yep. So that helps with that. Also, you can, if you do plan to use this NAS for snapshot replication, or not replication but snapshot, if you do plan to take a lot of snapshots, we recommend at least guaranteeing some space for the snapshots. So we recommend at least 20%. But if you don't have that much space to sacrifice, you can always go down to all the way to 5%. But less the guaranteed snapshot, less number of snapshots you can have for your NAS. So here you can also mention that as well. And other threshold, we default is 80%. So whenever the storage pool reaches 80%, the QNAP will start warning you that the space is being full, and a status light on the front of the NAS will start blinking red or orange, indicating that you're reaching your maximum capacity of your storage pool. So it's always important to understand and always keep track of that as well. Once you have done all of that, just hit next, and just gives you a summary of what you're trying to do, and hit create, and it will start creating a storage pool, right? That's how simple it is to create a storage pool. Nothing much on that. You just have to understand, especially for expansion, what RAID group you're going to be selecting. Also, just plan out your storage pool strategy. How many drives you want to include in your first RAID group. You can start with 12 drives. You can always expand that to another 12 drives later on. So here, when you create a storage pool, that's when you have to plan out your strategy. Another thing is the most important factor is creating a shared folder and your ICC lab. Right? The first, we're going to create a shared folder. That is where you're going to be actually saving or accessing or copying your data or accessing data from. So click on create and then new shared folder. And then now we have okay, with another thing before we start with that, another thing you note is that another major difference between QTS and QTS here is no volume layer, especially for shared folder, right? With QTS, you have to create a storage pool, then you have to create a volume, and then you get to access or create a shared folder, right? With QTS Hero, there's no volume layer anymore. So you create your storage pool, and directly there below that, you're gonna create a shared folder basically. So there's no volume you have to create. Just create a shared folder that you can create on top of storage pool. So once you've done that, hit start. And so basic options here is folder creation. So folder name, just put in the folder name. Comments, it's up to you. And then if you have multiple storage pool, which storage pool you want to create this folder on. And then here you do space allocation. You can do thick provisioning, which is basically, let's say for example, right now my storage pool 2 has 30 terabytes, almost 30 terabyte free space. Now if I do thick provisioning, I can say create this shared folder for 30 terabyte or 29 terabyte, for example, and it will immediately allocate 29 terabyte out of that storage pool. Now if I want to keep some space for my guaranteed snapshot, then I can lower this to maybe 24 terabyte. I can have 4 terabytes or 5 terabytes for my guaranteed snapshots, for my snapshot storage. But what happens when you create the storage pool of thick allocation, it will immediately take away 24 terabyte from that storage pool, and I will no longer have any space available because 24 is for my storage pool, 4 terabytes is my guaranteed snapshot. I'll be left with 1.14 terabyte left on my storage pool to do other stuff like create another shared folder. And then thin provisioning, you can mention the allocated, you can say I want to have 24 terabyte, but it's going to allocate a little bit space, and then it's going to keep adding more space as and when you start using the data. Right?
Yeah, so a simple way to say this is if you have a 10 terabyte folder thick provisioning with 1 gigabyte data, it takes 10 terabytes of space. If you have a 10 terabyte folder thin provisioning, 1 gigabyte of data, it takes barely more than 1 gigabyte of space. So thin provisioning, particularly when you have multiple folders, multiple share folders, will offer significantly better storage allocation, but thick provisioning has a small write speed benefit.
Yeah. So what is recommended over here is, so if you plan to have a lot of shared folder, then we're in thin provisioning at this point. Let's say, for example, for file server or for video editors, actually not for file server, because file server may have multiple folders for different departments, right? You have accounting, you have marketing, you have support. If you have multiple departments with multiple different shared folders, thin provisioning is the way to go. But for users who plan to just have one single folder and just dump all the data in there, like video editors do usually, then you can just create thin provisioning and then just allocate all the space for that particular folder. And there you go. You just don't have to worry about that anymore. But for users who are going to be having a lot of shared folders, then thin provisioning is the way to go. VMware accounts or file servers, those will have different things. Another thing to note is that when you do thin provisioning, it doesn't allow you to do select guaranteed snapshot. You just have to keep track of the snapshot space yourself, because when you do thin provisioning, you don't allocate all the space. You have a lot of space available on the shared folder. It's only when you start adding the data is when it's going to start growing on your storage pool. So there's no guaranteed snapshot at that point. You just have to understand where you want to keep. Just have to keep track of your usage on your NAS and make sure you don't use over 80%. So that alert threshold, when you reaches 80%, that means, and you are using snapshots, then you want to make sure you stop using at 80% and then start deleting some data to free up space or add another RAID group to expand your data. Right. Yeah. So that's there. So we're just gonna leave it at a small 1 terabyte space on thin provisioning. Another thing to note is encryption. Now there's no volume level encryption. With QuTS 0, there's shared folder encryption. So if you want to encrypt this particular folder, just check this box and input your password. Now it's very critical to make sure you understand what's your password, because if you do forget the password, then you may lose all your data. So it's very critical to have to understand. You save your password at multiple locations. Now there's another option right here is save encryption key. Is if you did check this box, when you reboot your NAS, QNAP will automatically unlock your volume and you have access to your data. You do have access to all your data immediately. If you do not check this box, when you reboot your NAS, QNAP will lock your shared folder and you won't have access to your data unless you come to your NAS and unlock the shared folder. So just something to note there. Once you have selected that, this is just the message it's giving you. So when you do thin provisioning, there's no guaranteed snapshot. So you keep track of your usage and do not use over 80% of your space. So you have enough space for your snapshot. So here's another storage setting. This is some tips and tricks right here that you need to understand. So data reduction is where you can set up your compression and deduplication, right? So it's always recommended to have compression, which is what is enabled by default.
Yeah, so compression is very lightweight. It doesn't take many resources. So in some scenarios, compression helps let you store more data and even helps get you more performance. And there's other situations where it doesn't help. Maybe the file is pre-compressed. But because compression is so lightweight, it helps when it can help, and it's good at not doing harm when it can't help. So it shouldn't ever hurt in any significant way. So you can just leave it on always, and it helps when it can help.
Yes. And deduplication, this is where, if you do plan to use deduplication, where you think you have a lot of duplicated data, then such as VM storage or backups for VM storage, because there's a lot of duplicated data, QNAP can help reduce the amount of space that is stored within the NAS, because what it sees that when you have a lot of duplicated blocks, QNAP only keeps the original blocks on your NAS. You save a lot of space, right?
Yeah. So deduplication works best with like a bunch of VM images. That's where it's most effective at saving space. In a lot of other scenarios, the space savings isn't as great. Deduplication has a performance cost, a RAM cost. So you probably only want to use it in situations where the space savings is worth the performance cost and RAM cost. So it's not for every situation.
Yes, and then also if you do plan to use deduplication, ensure that you have a lot of RAM available. We do say minimum of 16 gigabytes is recommended, but minimum is 16 gigabytes. But what we recommend is at least 32 gigs and above. So to have duplication. So deduplication, make sure to ensure that you have you have at least recommended of 32 gigabytes and above if you do plan to use deduplication. And fast clone is the same thing that we were talking about, which is the copy and write feature.
So fast clone can just copy the metadata. So imagine you have like 2 terabytes of something, like some file or something. If you want to make a clone, you can just copy the metadata. So it actually points to the same original block. So you could have like 10 clones of the same thing and not take much space. And then you can start working off your clone. And so it's a great way of space savings and making the clones really fast. And great if you're doing something you're not sure how it's going to turn out, you might want to do it on the clone rather than the original.
And then performance blocks, and then zone synchronous IO mode. You have options between standard, always, and none, right? So you can talk about that more.
Yeah, so I had earlier mentioned write coalescing, where you take the small writes, hold them in the RAM for a little bit, and group into larger chunks to write more sequentially for much better write performance. So using the RAM as a little bit of a write cache. But there are certain scenarios where that's forbidden, particularly when the NAS is not aware of where one file ends and the next file begins. That could actually make it more dangerous to hold stuff in the RAM. So in certain scenarios, so standard is basically let the application decide. So the writers of the application should know, is this a scenario where it's safe to let this stuff be held in the RAM? Is this a scenario where it's not safe? If it's not safe to hold it in the RAM, you write straight to the drives. If it's more large sequential, you write straight to the spinning drives typically. And if it's small random stuff, you write straight to the ZIL space. The ZIL space could be on the same SSDs as your L2R cache, or by default, it's on your system pool. So for ZIL synchronous I/O, it's about when do you write straight to the ZIL space, and when do you use RAM as a cache and do write coalescing. Standard is let the application decide. That's almost always the right thing to do. If it's a case like video editing, the NAS, if through like SMB, the NAS typically is aware of where one file ends and the next file begins, and then it is typically fine to do write coalescing. But if it's iSCSI, the NAS is typically not aware of where one file ends and the other file begins, and then that's often not safe to do write coalescing. The application should know. Standards is let the application decide.
Also with VMware and NFS as well, it's also another scenario where it QNAP will not know where the file started and ended. So in that scenario, so we always recommend to have it standard. Always means that it will always do synchronous I/O mode, and then none means it's just write straight to the hard drive. So, but just a tip, just make it standard, and that you should be fine on that part. Another important feature that you remember, or something you need to consider when you're setting up your shared folder is performance block. So we do have standard performance block, and we have 128K for larger files, and then we have 64K for Hyper-V, 32K for VMware, and then 4K for like database applications. So if you do plan to use this NAS for database applications, then 4K is highly recommended. For any kind of database application, media application of small file sizes, that 4K is recommended. If you do plan to use NFS for VMware, 32K is recommended. But anything else like file server, media streaming, video editing, then we recommend, or even backup servers, 128K is recommended. So it's really important to choose the right performance block to get the maximum benefit out of your NAS.
I should probably add something here. For deduplication, it takes a lot of RAM, but how much RAM it takes depends on block size. Because it's really, how much RAM it takes really depends primarily on how many blocks you have. So if you make the block size in half, you now have twice as many blocks in the same amount of storage. So if you want to, even though for VMware or something, we recommend 32K. If using deduplication, you want to think about this, just because 32K dedupe might take 4 times as much RAM about. If you're doing like 4K for database, I don't think you should even consider deduplication. It'd be astronomical amounts of RAM. So block size affects the RAM used by deduplication. It also affects how much RAM cache needs.
Yep. And so that's one thing. One more thing, and I think we have a comment here from George about WARM, respect to ransomware protection, and what is the features from WARM. Like WARM is basically write once, read many. So once you've written data inside a WARM folder, you cannot edit the data or delete the data unless you either delete the shared folder or delete the storage pool. So basically that's what the WARM feature is. Now, if you enable WARM on a particular folder, you do have 2 options right here. You have the enterprise option right here, and then you have the compliance option. Enterprise option is more lenient versus compliance. So enterprise, once you've written the data within the shared folder, you cannot modify or delete that data within that folder if the WARM is enabled. You can only delete the data once you delete the whole shared folder, right? So if you delete the whole shared folder, that you can delete the data. With compliance, it actually gets more strict. With compliance, you cannot even delete the data if you delete the whole shared folder. It won't allow you to delete the shared folder. You actually have to delete the whole storage pool and all the data within that storage pool to even delete the original data that you have written within the shared folder.
And you can't even modify the data. So yes. A big part of this is you can prove that the file on here now is unmodified from how it was when you put it there.
Yeah, so by default, we have I think the default is compliance. So you can enterprise, and then there's another option called log delay, which is basically is that all the file that you have added will be modified until the log delay expires. So once you write data, by default is 1 minute. So after 1 minute, you won't be able to write anything or delete anything within that folder. But if the log delay, once the log delay expires, the data is logged basically. So you can either check this box or uncheck this box, or you can also specify, I think, 168 hours and 59 minutes is the maximum time that you can do for log delay. So you can delay for that many hours or days, and then you can still modify the data within that shared folder. And once that expires, the data is locked permanently. And then retention is, once again, you can set up your retention days for how much data that read-only. So it's basically read-only at that point, right? So the read-only attribute will be checked within that data. So the retention is basically how long you want to keep that read-only attributes enabled within that particular data. So you can basically you can ask the QNAP to retain the data for 1 day, 1 year, 1 month. So when you write that data within that folder, it will. So let's say, for example, if you keep it for 1 month, that data will be read-only state for 1 whole month, and after that expires, you can edit the data off of the NAS. So basically, that's how the WARM works. So that's basically the basic intention of WARM. WARM is intended to keep your data to keep it intact in its original format. Is that correct? Right. So basically, for compliance purposes. So for compliance purposes, basically there are many industry like healthcare provider or government businesses that would like to keep that data in its original format. So with WARM, you can always prove to the agencies that the data that was written in this was in the original format. So there's a question is, so one must set log delay to allow required write time. So write time is not so the folder is always write allowed. So you're always allowed to access that folder and write to it, right? The log delay only allows that data that, let's say, for example, if you've written an Excel sheet within that WARM folder, right? The log delay will, let's say, for example, if you keep the log delay by default, which is 1 minute, you can edit that Excel file for a whole minute before that Excel file, that log delay expires, and the Excel file is then at that point read only. So you cannot edit that data or Excel file, but you can always write new data in that shared folder. Even with the log delay expires, you still are able to write new data. You can always write another Excel sheet, a third Excel sheet, fourth Excel sheet, fifth Excel sheet with no problem. It's only editing or deleting that the first Excel sheet is stopped after the log delay expires. Hopefully that confirms that question or answer.
For an analogy, I ever sent an email in like 10 seconds after you hit send, you made a mistake? And so it's that kind of thing. You know, you put this on here, it's now going to be unchangeable for years. But if you realize you made a mistake in the first minute, you could potentially correct the mistake. After a minute goes by, you can't change it if the log delay is 1 minute.
Exactly. And similarly, retention is for a whole month. You cannot edit the Excel file, but after the for a whole month, after that, the retention expired. You can now edit that Excel sheet. Basically, that's retention. So by default, retention is always disabled, and log delay is enabled for 1 minute. You can also disable that to be more compliant. And once you've written, that's it. It's done. Applications such as backup or other applications may not work. So if you're trying to use, if you're trying to use third-party applications that's writing to this data, you have to ensure that application does not require editing the original data. For example, backup applications, right? There are certain backup applications that will write a small hidden database file that it needs to see, because it needs to, usually backup softwares are like the software that will incremental backups, right? The way incremental works, maybe in certain backup softwares, it will write a small hidden file within that folder, and it needs to look up that hidden file and edit the hidden file to make sure it does the next backup and the next backup. So WARM folder may not work for those backup softwares because it cannot edit the hidden file that is within the WARM folder. So Some applications may fail when you have worm enabled. So worm is best used in a manual case scenario where you're trying to copy something and you understand that it's worm folder, you cannot delete something or edit something. Yeah, I think George had that point, right? Veeam BU jobs to it. I think Veeam would fail when you try to do on a worm folder. I think Veeam, you may have to check with Veeam. I think they may have a feature that allows you to do a backup job to worm folder, but on the QNAP's end, it may fail. So just in long enough delay. So I think George has a. So if you have a long enough delay time, so if you have a long, let's say if you set up long, let's say if you have a job that runs every few minutes or every few hours, you can set up a delay time for that many hours, and you can still edit the data, but then and after that many hours, it will just log that backup job permanently, basically.
Yeah. So let's say you do a version today, and then tomorrow you do a new version. Well, your second version might involve editing some metadata file.
Exactly.
And you might just not be able to do it. So it might stop you from adding your second version. There are ways that potentially might not work if the editing software is not optimized for worm storage.
Okay. So that's the worm. Hopefully that we will answer all your questions on that. The next is permissions. So by default, as I mentioned, admin is disabled. So all the future, if you disable admin, all your future folder creation will have admin won't have access to those folders. But because you are admin, you will always have access to read and write. And then you can actually deny access. If you have more users, you'll be listed right down right here. You can deny them, either provide them read only, deny access, or read and write access, basically. And then here is basically the privilege settings for your. This is just Samba settings, right? You have oplocks, Samba encryption, all those features that are enabled right here. It's the same feature sets that we took from QuTS, so it's the same thing. The only thing I want to note is a couple of things right here. If you do plan to use this folder as your time machine backup, then you want to enable. You can make sure to enable this particular box, and time machine will be, and then you can use this folder as a time machine backup. Another thing is oplocks. You can enable this or disable oplocks. By default, it's enabled. And if you want to hide this folder in your network drive, you can just check this box, and you won't be able to see this folder in your network drive as well, basically. So that is it. You can also do guest access right here. So if you want to have this folder for guest access, we can read only, read and write, and all those right here. Hit next. Summary just gives you information about the summary that you have. And then hit finish, and it will create the shared folder for you. All right, anything else you want to add here? That's it, right?
Yeah, I think I'm good now.
All right, perfect. Now, before we move on to the next part, which is creating an iSCSI LUN, I want to give it a few more minutes and we'll take a 5-minute break for any Q&A, any question and answers. I was able to answer all your questions while on the go, but if you guys have any further questions, you can either unmute yourself or just put that in chat, and we'll help answer that for you. And if you guys like to see any specific demo for a specific part of the Q operating system, just let me know. We can always go off topic, and we can always discuss further on whatever you guys want to see a demo for, or whatever you guys want to discuss. I understand we do have a set topic line, but workshop is basically want to encourage you to ask as many questions or get as much information as possible. So anything else that you want to discuss today as well, or you want to see demo for, and we are able to demo that for you, then we'll be glad to help you with that. Does QNAP work with Azure or AWS? So that is also this response to Azure Archive automatically. So we do support Azure and AWS for either backup, or you can use it for hybrid mount, which is basically mounting a drive from Azure, like a bucket from Azure or AWS onto your NAS. You can start uploading or downloading file from that user, or you can use it for a backup application.
Immutable refers to worm, right?
Immutable is, I think, yes, immutable is Azure's worm. You can upload that. You can still upload data to it, but the other backup jobs may fail. That's part.
Okay, but for Azure, we can back up to a worm folder.
Worm folder, yeah. But your backup job, it's only one-time backup jobs that you can do. The other backup jobs may fail. AWS object locking, we are working on that, but currently there's no update as of yet. We'll have to check on that, but there'll be an update for, I think, HBS 3 for do object locking on AWS. Gary has a question. I have two 1 terabyte NVMe M.2 drives in the NAS. How do I set them up to be repository of the OS and cache?
Yeah, so if you an SSD system pool is usually more important to performance than SSD cache. If you only have 2 SSDs, system pool should almost always be the priority.
And then basically to have your system pool, you have to make sure that the first storage pool you create will be your system pool. Is it faster to do iSCSI or better NFS at QuTS Hero? Also caching SSD and NVMe possible with use of SSD order. Now, I think iSCSI is recommended for better performance.
So I mean, ZIL helps a lot with iSCSI write speed. If you're talking about L2ARC cache, it should work on iSCSI. And so L2ARC cache is read-only cache. And actually, I think it's a good question here because there's many different use cases in iSCSI, but a lot of times in iSCSI, people care a lot about IOPS. So if you have primarily HDD storage, you want some L2ARC cache to help with the random performance in some cases, that L2ARC cache can help. And it can also work with NFS, right? Was the question what's faster? I think in most cases, iSCSI will be faster than NFS.
Although it's it's better to use iSCSI because you're getting a block storage for your, let's say, for example, the best example I think this comes into mind is VMware, right? Because you do have the option to do NFS or iSCSI. With VMware, when you do iSCSI, you get, and let's say 20 terabyte of iSCSI LUN that you, so when a VMware sees it, it sees a raw 20 terabyte iSCSI LUN, and it creates its own file system on top of that. And on the QNAP's end, there's no file system to worry about. So it's just basically a raw block of data that the QNAP has given to your NAS, or with iSCSI protocol, which is also a lightweight protocol as well. With NFS, you have your ZFS file system based on top of that NFS, and then you have NFS file system, sorry, not a file system, but NFS protocol that it needs to communicate, which is still a better way to communicate, but it's still it's better. The iSCSI is still lightweight, more lightweight than NFS. So I would always recommend iSCSI for if you do have the option to using NFS. And iSCSI or NFS. There are certain scenarios that NFS is better than iSCSI, and that will be file server, right? File server. You can also use a Windows computer and do an iSCSI raw space, and then just format that with NTFS or exFAT, and then use your QNAP, and you can use your QNAP iSCSI into a Windows computer. But if you're using it for file server, then you have to use your Windows to share your data out to other computers, right? But with NFS or Asamba, you can actually have the QNAP be your shared folder. You just create a shared folder in the QNAP, and then you can use all the other computers to directly access the QNAP rather than your computer and then the QNAP, basically. But for like one-to-one connection, basically like VMware, it's just one-to-one, then iSCSI would be better.
So this question, the last question is a good one, right? Can you move the system pool? Let's say you set up your NAS and you did not know that you're supposed to have an SSD system pool. And by default, the first pool you make is your system pool. So now if you make an SSD pool after the fact, it's not your first pool. So the question is there a way to, after the fact, add an SSD pool, make it your system pool? And there is that option of what's safely detached pool, right?
Safely detached pool on the QNAP.
Do we want to attempt to demo this? Do you think we could do that or no?
You can actually, there is a way to do it, but we don't, it's not recommended though.
Okay.
Where you can safely detach a pool and then you can add your SSD and then create another pool, but we don't recommend doing that actually.
Okay, so basically just really try hard to remember to get this right the first time. Make the SSD pool first, then make your HDD pool. Because though there might be some other ways, the other ways might have some risks. So we're not recommending changing it after the fact. So we're highly recommending just, so I guess in this case, what can you do? You can contact our tech support and see if tech support feels up to helping you do this in a reasonably safe way, and they could advise if you're in that situation.
And then we also have put in a request to developers to see if there is a way, because when you create a system pool, that actually goes into creating that system pool, right? You have all the configuration, backup configuration, everything is all stored in that one single volume. To move all of that to another pool, it's actually difficult to move that. So that is the reason we don't have a simpler way to do that option. But we do have, we have actually asked a developer to see if there's a way to actually do, there's a way to move system pools. But as of yet, there's no recommended way of moving your system pool. Is clustering possible with QuTS Hero NAS? We talk about no, unfortunately, not on the QNAP's end. There's no clustering possible within the QNAP's end. But if you have VMware environment, you can actually basically have two data stored from two different VMware, two different QNAP NASs, and then you can use that with your VMware. But on the QNAP's end, there's no clustering possible.
Yeah, so basically we support iSCSI and fiber channels, so we can present QNAP storage as object storage to whatever, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if you have a cluster and you want to add more storage to your cluster, you could buy a bunch of QNAPs, add QNAPs to your cluster. But we don't at this time have the full cluster solution. You can add QNAP storage to your cluster, but you would need something besides just QNAP to manage that cluster.
Yes, Gary. So yes, Gary, to move your system pool today, recommended way is to delete your current storage pool, delete all the storage pool on your NAS, and then create a new storage pool on your SSD drives, and start with that. So then the SSD will be your storage pool at that point. Great questions. Thank you so much for that. I will wait a couple of more minutes before we move on. It's cold today, huh? It's raining out here today. It's really cold.
Very cold in here.
So we had to get a jacket. All right, so again, all right, let's get another question. I started with 6 drives, and in my 8-bay unit, I have 2 more drives. Can I add them to my RAID 5 array? So unfortunately, that's what we were referring to before. Unfortunately, you cannot do that with the QuTS Hero. You cannot add drives on the go on the current RAID group. You have to create a new RAID group to expand the storage pool. So basically, and I would not recommend in your scenario, because the new RAID group will be RAID 1, and that will be bad for performance. RAID 5 on that, and RAID 1 on the second RAID group.
Now, if you need a little more storage, you can add a RAID 1 and get a little more storage. It's not that optimal for performance. It's probably not catastrophic for performance.
No, it's not catastrophic. It's not going to delete data. It's just, I would highly recommend to create a new storage pool with the RAID 1 rather than expanding the current storage pool.
Yeah. So yeah, it just depends on the situation you're in. If you're okay having 2 storage pools, that probably is better. If you just have a need to make your current storage pool a bit bigger, if you make the RAID 1, obviously the RAID 1 has less performance than your RAID 5. The one upside of this is it will write to your RAID 1 less often, because it writes to RAID groups based on how much storage in them. So it's the less performing RAID group, but it writes to it less often, and that's why it's not catastrophic to performance, but it's far from ideal.
Yes.
And so if you're okay with 2 storage pools, it's probably better to make a second storage pool.
Yeah, just create a storage pool with RAID 1. You should still get the same capacity. It'll just be two different folders. You have to worry about that at that point. All right, perfect. So let's move on with the demo. Do not worry if you guys have any further questions, you can always just keep putting them in the chat. As I mentioned, we also recommend unmute ourselves as well. We'll have a Q&A session in the end as well, and we'll keep continuing with the demo for now. Okay. So next part I want to before we move on to caching, I want to show is I6Z creation. So you can create a new block-based LUN on your QNAP NAS, which is basically an I6Z LUN. So create a new block-based LUN, just click on create on the same page and click on create. Most of the scenarios will remain the same. So whatever we discussed before also applies here as well. So LUN name, you can just put in your LUN name, storage pool, which storage pool you want to have this LUN on. Thin provisioning, thick provisioning. Again, here I would recommend thick provisioning or thin provisioning, right? So it depends,
for
right?
For a LUN, it depends on the situation, right? Like if there's a VM in there, how are you using that? How are you using that VM? I think a LUN would just it depends on the use case.
So for VMware, maybe thin provisioning would be better. Or if you have one-to-one connection, just using it for a Windows computer, Windows 10 computer, and just using it to expand the computer storage, then just thick provisioning and just add a few terabytes of it, and then just add that to your Windows 10, and you don't worry about that anymore. And then the capacity, you can select the capacity that you want. Again, it's the same scenario. If you do thin provisioning, you don't have to worry about the guaranteed snapshot space, but you do have to keep track of your usage. Make sure you ensure you don't use all of your space on your storage pool. And then compression, deduplication, alert threshold, same scenario, same method applies here as well. Fast clone, synchronous IO, everything remains the same here. Anything that you want to add here?
No, I mean, because it's very similar to how you set it.
Yeah. The only thing you have to do understand is performance block, right? So
yeah, listed Hyper-V here. It didn't list that in the folder, which makes sense.
Yeah. So Hyper-V basically allows you to do Hyper-V only allows you to do I6Z. So I6Z, the 64K is listed right here for Hyper-V, and then 32K for VMware, and then for other applications, it's the same thing that we discussed. So there's nothing much different between that. Most use case scenarios for I6Z is like a Hyper-V or VMware, right? So you have to ensure that you select the correct one. I think by default it selects Hyper-V, which is 64K. So if you do plan to use this VMware for your VMware scenarios, ensure to select 32K. Just don't forget to do that, because that optimizes better for performance. So ensure that you select 32K for VMware, and then you hit create, and that will create your storage pool. I'm sorry, your I6Z LAN. That's it, right? Anything that you want to add here?
I think I'm good.
Yeah, perfect. So let's go back to presentation for a few more minutes, and then we can continue with. All right, next is caching.
Yeah, so let's talk about cache on ZFS. So on ZFS, there's ARC cache, which is actually RAM cache. There's L2 ARC cache, which is SSD read cache, and there's ZIL, the ZIL space, which makes the synchronous writes faster, but doesn't really affect the asynchronous writes. So first, ARC cache. You might notice that even if you have even 128 gigs of RAM, you're not going to have a huge amount of free space, because it's better for performance to take the free space and actually use it for something. Don't just leave RAM idle on the table, but if nothing else needs that RAM, nothing else is using that RAM, just use it to cache more data. So whatever files or blocks of data that you've been accessed most frequently, it can be in the RAM cache for extremely fast access. And then, but it's still available RAM, because if you run a VM or something and it needs the RAM, it can just take the RAM from the RAM cache. So RAM cache is available but not free. That's the distinction there. So you should probably not have much free, but a good amount of available.
And one more thing I want to add is this is where it differs from other operating systems, right? Or another file system, right? With QuTS, let's say if you have a 16 gig of RAM and applications are not using it, then it's going to just keep that. Like you're just using maybe 3-4 gigs of RAM. Then out of 16 gig, 12 gigs is just wasted space that is not being used at all. if you install more applications, run VMs on top of that, you can start using that 16 gigs. But with with ZFS, it sees that you have 12 gigs of available space, and it will start using it for other purposes. And let's say, so it will start using more RAM to give you better performance, to cache more data off of the NAS, and if you do plan to start using more VMs and you start using that 16 gigabytes, the ZFS will then basically release the RAM to use for those VMs. So it doesn't. So if it sees unused space, it will start using it for better performance and more data caching. But if you need more RAM for your applications, ZFS will release more space to give you. So you're not locked into once ZFS uses your extra RAM, it's not like that. It just doesn't block it. You can always take back the RAM for your applications.
Yeah. And so basically, this RAM cache is extremely fast cache. And so even if you don't run a lot of applications, it still can be great to have a lot of RAM. So you can have as much RAM cache as possible. On ZFS, just with more RAM, you just tend to get more performance. So on QuTS, it's like a basic file server. Once you have like 16 gigs of RAM, going to 32 has less benefit. Going to 64 has less benefit. You don't see as much benefit as you have more RAM. But on ZFS, you keep adding RAM, and it really helps a lot for that really fast, large amount of extremely fast RAM cache. Now, L2ARC is SSD read cache. So basically, when files get evicted from the RAM cache, so let's say it's been a little bit of time since you've accessed this file, and now it needs room for the next thing that's being accessed more frequently, kicks it onto the RAM cache. You can have it put it on to the SSD read-only L2ARC cache. Now, something to note here is the ARC cache is just extremely fast for everything, but the L2ARC cache is a little more optimized for random access than sequential access. So most of the time, I recommend set L2ARC to random only. Now, as I mentioned before, HDD storage pools perform really well on QuTS Hero. So you can already get a huge amount of throughput from a good number of HDDs. So that's typically where the throughput comes from, is the HDD pool itself. But the L2ARC can be great for increasing the random performance on a bunch of small reads.
And again, L2ARC works in tandem with your RAM. So it still uses your RAM, available space in your RAM, and with SSD to give you better performance. So it works in tandem. So it uses all the available space that it can get, basically, to give you better benefits and to basically cache more data and give you better benefits.
So ZIL, you can think of it as ZIL cache. I often like to call it ZIL space because there is always a ZIL, always. Even if you only had an HDD storage pool, if you only just had HDD and your system pools on HDD, there will be a ZIL space on your HDDs because there will always be certain applications that require you to write directly to the drives. And when that happens, basically certain applications say you're not allowed to use RAM as a write cache. You're not allowed to do write coalescing. In this particular application, that wouldn't be safe. And so when that happens, the large sequential writes write straight to the spinning drives, and the small random stuff writes to the ZIL space. You also have the option of moving your ZIL space to the same SSDs as your L2ARC cache. And you also have the option of making just a third SSD space with the ZIL space there. I do just want to mention two things. First, ZIL is really only helping with the speed of the synchronous I/O. So if you're video editing through SMB, the NAS is aware of files. So you're typically doing write coalescing. So ZIL should not make any noticeable difference. But with iSCSI, the ZIL space can help a lot, or any case where the NAS is not aware of files that typically will use the ZIL. For the L2ARC, you constantly write to those. As you read data, you write it to the L2ARC so that next time you can read it from the ARC cache, right? From the L2ARC cache. So you're constantly writing to your L2ARC, but you're not constantly writing nearly as heavy to your system pool. So if you have your ZIL and your L2ARC SSDs, you're writing so much to the L2ARC that you're actually using some of that write performance. And also L2ARC SSDs have a higher likelihood of failing because you write to them so much more.
Yeah, and then again, so ZIL works in scenarios like VMware, Hyper-V, where you may get maximum benefit. For other scenarios like file server video editing, you may not get that much benefit out of using ZIL or write cache with ZFS.
Now, something to note is L2ARC takes RAM, and it's more RAM than we need with QuTS. So with 128 gigs of RAM, you can have up to 4 terabytes of L2ARC. And so if you have only 32 gigs of RAM, you can only have 1 terabyte of L2ARC. And now you might think that's a problem, but remember I mentioned I recommend set L2ARC to random only in almost every case. Well, if you set it to random only, you're only caching the small stuff, right? You're not going to, because the big files will be sequential. So if you're only caching the small stuff, even a small amount of cache can typically do the job just fine. But you can't effectively use as much cache. And so 128 gigs of RAM, 4 terabytes of cache if your block size is 128K. But if your block size is say 54 or 64K, you need even more RAM. Basically, how much RAM you use for your cache depends on how many blocks. Make the block size half, you now have twice as many blocks and the same amount of cache. You choose 32K, now you've set the block size in half again. You have now 4 times as much blocks. And if you only had, say, 4K, I just wouldn't use cache. I would probably just never use L2ARC cache with 4K block size.
Yeah, so more RAM is required for caching. As compared to QuTS, QuTS allows you to have up to 4 terabyte of cache, which is a relatively smaller RAM size. But with QuTS Hero, you have to ensure that you have enough RAM. So with just basic point here is ensure to have enough RAM if you plan to use ZFS. ZFS requires a lot of RAM for a lot of purposes. Basically, caching is the main mechanism where it uses a lot of RAM. Deduplication also another method where it requires a lot of RAM. So ensure that you have enough RAM available for using it with ZFS. So, and if you notice with our ZFS units, maximum memory always is very higher than comparatively QuTS units, right? QuTS may max out at 16 gigs of RAM as a max RAM, but with Hero models, we usually tend to have 128 gigs as a base max memory, and then you can always expand to a terabyte even as well for maximum for higher units as well, like QES units, and then I think 2490FQ I think has higher unit as well. So and that's the main reason is because of caching, right? So let's look at a small live demo for caching. To enable caching on your QNAP NAS, just go to Storage and Snapshot and click on Cache Acceleration, and click on the plus button right here, and then just follow the instructions. Basically, now with QuTS Hero 5.0, you have 2 options to do caching. Now, either you can use the same SSD drives to do both read and write cache, or you can actually have separate SSDs for read cache and another SSD for your write cache. If you do plan to use for same for read write cache, even number of SSDs are required, so 2 or 4. But for having different read and write cache for different SSDs, minimum is 3, but we recommend higher. Right? So next we're gonna select next. You can select the drive. You can select which drive you want for read cache, which drive, and then the other drive will be for your write cache. And then you can set up your read cache right here. If you don't want to use ZIL, then just select create cache for read or write. Hit next and just set up your read cache right here, and just don't add another cache for your write cache. And then hit next, and here it gives you the ability of what folder you want to actually cache. So with QNAP, you can actually select what folders you want to cache, because if, let's say, for example, if you're using it for file server where you have a lot of folders or different purposes, right? You can use QNAP NAS for your file server as a backup server, media streaming server. So you can actually have different folders for them, right? So one is for your file server, one is for your media server, third is for your backup, basically, just to give you a simple example. So let's say you don't want to cache anything for your backup, because I don't want to do any kind of caching for your backup. You just want to be a simple backup server that just does 1 gig of backup. It just does a small backup server backing my Windows computer, time machine backup, just that don't care the performance from them. So you can just uncheck that particular backup folder, and then you have more cache space available for your media streaming or for your video editing, for your file server, right? So you can control what you want to cache, and then just don't cache the rest of that. Even for media streaming services, you may not require caching because you're limited to your file type, right? The streaming server don't require, it's what, 50 megabits per second. Actually, it's not, and you're limited to your streaming server. So because you're streaming 1080p or 4K videos, it doesn't require caching at all. Believe me, I've tested that as Sophia. There's no caching that requires. So you can also uncheck streaming from there as well, just easily for file server. Maybe video editing definitely will require caching. So enable it for video caching, enable it for your file server, but no, backup server, media streaming don't require read cache at all. So if you're using it primarily for those purposes, don't bother having caching at all. Basically backup or media streaming. For other purposes, having caching is a good option. VMware, file server, video editors, Hyper-V, data store, those database applications, again, those will have benefits of having caching. So once you uncheck or check the box that you want to cache, hit next and hit random IO or IO. So you want to talk about more here?
Yeah, so with L2ARC cache, it seems a little better optimized for random IO. And the HDD storage pool tends to have amazing sequential performance. So in almost every case, it's usually better to choose random IO when with QUTS Hero because of how big the throughput is on the HDD storage pool already, how the L2ARC tends to be optimized a little more for random.
And this is why it says you select only all IO if your cache read performance is better than pool read performance. That's so if you think your cache is better performance, then you may want to select all IO. But if you think your cache is the pool read performance is better than your caching, then random IO is always recommended. So once you have done that, hit select and hit create. That will create your caching. Similarly, if you want to just do your ZIL caching, then just hit next, create that. Just select read ZIL. With ZIL, you have to always at least have minimum of 2 drives. You have to have a redundancy with ZIL caching. So RAID 1 or RAID 10, depending upon the number of SSDs. Select that. Similarly, with ZIL caching, there's no folder creation, it's storage pool. So which storage pool you want to do ZIL caching on? Anything you want to add here?
Yeah, it doesn't ask you what folder to apply ZIL to because on any folder, potentially there could be an application that says, I don't want you doing write coalescing. I want you write straight to the drives. So there must always be a ZIL space in case a particular application says, I want you to write straight to the drives for safety purposes.
Yeah, so once you've done that, hit select, hit create, that will create your ZIL caching. If you do want to use the same SSD for both read and write cache, you select the first option, hit next, select the SSD drives, and then hit next. So here you can select which storage pool you want which folder you want for read cache and which storage pool you want for write cache. Once you select those options, so random IO, all IO, and here QNAP will do RAID 0, a part of that SSD for read cache, and a part of the SSD will be RAID 1. So it creates 2 different RAID groups on that same SSD drives. For ZIL, it will use RAID 1, and for read cache will use RAID 0 for better performance, and ZIL basically for redundancy. And hit create, and then it will start creating that read for caching. Okay, and I think that is for caching. And the last couple of things we want to talk about is set up your NAS for optimal performance. Let's say, for example, if you do plan to use your NAS for VMware, then this is what we recommend to have for your QuTS Hero NAS. Make sure you have SSD storage pool for your operating system or apps. So if you have M.2 drives available, then use M.2s, or you can sacrifice a couple of bays on your front to do for creating a storage pool. We do considering RAID 10 would be a great option. Again, basically, but it does cut your storage in half. But we want you to consider if you can use RAID 10 if your space requirement is not that high. But if you do require a lot of space, then RAID 50, RAID 60. Actually, RAID 60 is recommended for better redundancy. Okay, choosing block, as I mentioned, choosing block K. 32K is recommended for VMware, and for database applications, if you're running a database application, then you want to run as 4K. But don't use 4K if you plan to use RAID 5 or RAID 6, right?
Yeah, but basically the way these work is if you do RAID 5 or RAID 6, where the block size is the same as the sector size, we end up having terrible storage. It's just bad for storage efficiency, and it's not even good for performance. So it's just RAID 5 and RAID 6, because we write to 4K sectors on the drive, if the record size is the same size as the sector size, you effectively can't strike your data across multiple drives. And you could end up with like 1/3 storage efficiency on RAID 6. You could end up with bad performance. So 4K is only for RAID 10 or RAID 1. It should probably not be used on the other RAID. I guess technically it can be RAID 0, but don't like to recommend RAID 0 because it's dangerous. But definitely not, I would not recommend it for RAID 5, RAID 6, or triple parity.
And then again, going back to the first point, we want you to consider having SSD storage pool as well so if you do for your hard drives as well, for your data store, if you can have all your SSDs basically for the whole NAS, like a 2490 FU, then that will be the fastest. That will be the best option for you. And NVMe is, again, as I mentioned, as everybody knows, NVMe is the fastest. So a NAS like 2490 FU would be a great unit for VMware data store. That gives you better performance, or it gives you best performance out of your NAS, and also optimal performance, optimal configuration as well. For ZIL space, we recommend fast and low latency space. So basically, if you have a NAS with hard drives, but you do have M.2s, NVMe, basically use that for your ZIL caching.
Yeah, actually, I want to add also, I think for the ZIL, wherever the ZIL is, having power loss protection is good for the SSDs, because ZIL is really designed right straight to the drive, so that if you have a power loss during a write, you don't risk data corruption. And so it's great if your ZIL space has power loss protection. It adds even an extra degree of safety.
Yeah, UPS, yes.
UPS too. I mean, some SSDs themselves have built-in power loss protection, so that SSDs have like DRAM cache, but if you do it right with power loss protection, you can still use DRAM cache effectively to make the SSDs perform better, lower latency, but still have power loss protection and not lose any data if power is lost right in the middle of the write.
Yep. So that's for VMware. For optimal throughput, basically for situations like file server, media streaming, or video editing, again, the same first point remains the same. SSD pool is recommended for operating system. So the first pool that you create is recommended to create on SSD drives. Consider RAID 6 or RAID 10 for hard drives. So if you want, for your regular storage, recommend RAID 6 or RAID 10 for your hard drive storage pool. If you want more space, then RAID 6. If you're okay with having a smaller space, then RAID 10 is considered. We consider RAID 10 for them. You can also consider for larger bay units like 12 bay or 16 bay or 24 bay or 30 bay, you can consider RAID 50. But for larger units, RAID 60 is recommended. It's safer basically because you have 2 drive redundancy on each RAID group, whereas with RAID 50 or RAID 5, basically it's only 1 drive redundancy. So if you lose multiple drives on a single RAID group, you end up losing all the drives. RAID 6 will help with that as well. And again, as I mentioned, consider for larger units, then RAID 60 is recommended, because it gives you better redundancy, right? You have multiple redundancies with RAID 60. Multiple RAID 5s or RAID 6 in a storage pool can also be faster. So creating multiple RAID 5s in a single storage pool can also help with performance as well. And then if you want to use cache only, make sure to set up as random only, right? Anything you want to add?
I think I'm good.
All right, perfect. So that is for optimal configuration. That's a couple of optimal configuration that we think that most of our customers use it for. And actually, that will be it for today. We're gonna now open up for a Q&A, and after that we can end today's workshop. So let's see how many questions we have. So only one question for now that we have. A new question is, okay, so in order to make SSD system pool, I must delete the current storage pool and start all over. Yes. So if you want to start, if you do have a current configuration and you did not create an SSD storage pool, then deleting all the currently only recommended option is to delete all the pools. Back up your data, obviously, delete all the pools, and then create a new first pool will be created on your SSD drives. All right, so with that, we're going to open up the floor for last Q&A session before we end today's workshop. Again, so you guys always have the option if you unmute yourself or just keep asking questions through chat. And then, so George has a question is, so pool one by definition is system pool. Yes, so first pool is always the system pool with QuTS Hero. These are just started no data on the NAS, but perfect. So that's a great time for this workshop then for you. I thought it was somebody unmuted. Somebody speaking in the background. I think we covered most of the things today, right? So yeah, mostly configuration. Also, this is a good chance to ask you guys if you guys have any further recommendation of what future workshops should look like, or what you guys want to, what topics you guys want to consider doing for us to do in the future. You can always let us know. Our Docker containers fully support getting all the Docker Hub and QTS Hero. The container station is supported with QTS Hero. Yeah. Yeah,
and the container station does have access to the Docker Hub.
Yes. So the same thing with QTS. So just download container station, and you will have access to all the containers from the Docker Hubs as well. Just as I was saying, yeah, if you have any further suggestions for us, you can always email us at ussales@qnap.com or just let us know here. We'll be posting this particular workshop on our YouTube channel. So if you guys missed it, if you want to go back and look up some information, you can always just look up the follow-up email we'll be sending shortly, and then you can always play back that YouTube video. And we have done a lot of workshops this year. So if you want to have access to all the workshops, you can always go to QNAP Live. Go to our QNAP channel on our YouTube channel, on YouTube, and then you can get access to all the recorded workshops that we have previously.
And if you look over this video again, you might have more questions, and that's fine. So yeah, it could be USA Sales, it could be your emails, you can message me on Reddit. We're very happy to answer questions that might come to your mind as you're considering this later.
Perfect. So it seems that no further questions. So thank you very much for joining today, everyone, and just stay tuned. And stay tuned for our future workshop, and we'll be starting next year, 2022. We'll have some new topics for you guys, and hopefully you guys are able to join those workshops as well. Yeah, there's a question for you. How can you reach Reddit?
Oh, I mean, I'm QNAP Daniel at Reddit, so you can message me there. We have a Reddit page. We also have the forums. And then it's fine to email me as well. But yeah, feel free to go on our forums at our QNAP, and you can message me there.
All right, perfect. All right. Again, thank you very much, everybody. You guys have a great day.